Thank you for joining us for part 5 of the sermon series From Rows to Circles. In this message, Jeremy uses a familiar story from the Old Testament to teach us that engaging in community isn't optional, it's essential. If you have any questions about this message or Crosswind Church, please visit our website at www.crosswindchurch.net or email us at info@crosswindchurch.net.
Well, if you have your Bibles, pull them out. We'll need them in just a minute. Jody and I, when we moved here, actually long before we moved to Union City, we kind of began the process, the lovely, wonderful, hated, dreaded process of looking for a house. In fact, when we moved, one of the things we did is we wanted to rent for about a year so that we could, find the neighborhood we wanted to live in, the house we wanted to live in, weren't going to be rushed, that sort of thing. And so I feel like in that process, in that time, we've looked at every house in Union City, in Obion County. We've been out in the country, we've been in the city, we've looked at big houses, small houses, we looked at expensive houses, cheap houses. We've looked at houses with great big front porches and great big decks on the back, and we've looked at all kinds of houses. We've looked at houses ad nausea all the way through. We've looked at them all. And one of the things I started reflecting on this last week that I thought was kind of interesting is this is the third state that Jody and I have actually looked for a house in. It's the third state that we've had to kind of go through this process in. And every place that you go looking for a home, there's different things that are important in that area. It's kind of neat. Everybody kind of has their own personality. And so in Texas, in the neighborhoods where we live, no one built front porches on their house. So they were just like front stoops. You remember like watching Andy Griffith and like Opie and Aunt Bee and Andy be out on the front porch, and he'd be strumming the guitar and they'd be sipping sweet tea, and the neighbors walking by in the evening would want to stop by and have a glass of tea and say hello. Like in Texas, nope, that's not what we did. No front porches in Texas. Everything was backyard oriented. So they would build these huge decks on the back of their house with big grills and smokers and swimming pools and all that, and they would put up privacy fences so that no one could see in. That was kind of that. So that, in fact, privacy fences in Fort Worth, that was a city code. You had to have them. Okay? And so everyone kind of just, their goal was to be kind of isolated. We want to be able to enjoy our yard, enjoy our home, but we don't really want a whole bunch of other people kind of hacking into that or kind of getting involved in that or seeing what we're doing. Okay? And so that was kind of the mentality. When we moved to Alabama, it was a little different. People bought or built front porches on their house in Alabama, but you know what they did? They bought their front porch and their house along with about 6, 10, 20 acres of land because their goal was to get as far away from their neighbor as they possibly could, right? There was their own land, their own thing, and they wanted to be able to see somebody coming from a long way off. I don't know if it's because they had stuff to hide or they needed to get their guns out. Like, I don't know what it was, but it was just this sense of, hey, I want to be isolated. I kind of want to be by myself. Here in Tennessee, it's a little mixture of both, depending on whether you want to live out in the county or live here in the city. But regardless of that, one of the things that I kind of have found true no matter where you look for homes is this. Homes are designed, no matter where we live, homes are designed to try to make us autonomous. In fact, they're designed to kind of bring us into isolation. Think about that. All the luxuries that you put in your house are so that you don't have to go out anymore, right? When we put in big, huge kitchens and learn how to cook so that we don't ever have to go out and get anything, right, which I highly recommend because it's cheaper that way, or we put in 60, 70, bigger even than that, flat screen TVs and get our Netflix subscription so I don't ever have to go back to the movies, right? And deal with the crowds and deal with the people. And we want to make sure we have all of the amenities so that we never have to leave. And if we're not careful, we'll start to think that the American dream is about autonomy and isolation. The more isolated I can get, the more autonomous I can get, the more I've actually kind of achieved what it is that I want to achieve. Even the technology that we carry around in our purses, in our pockets, you understand it's wonderful and has connected us with more people more than ever before. Yet, I went to go visit some family, this was a while back, around Christmas time, and we were sitting in the living room, and there were 6 of us sitting in the living room, each one on some kind of iDevice. A phone, an iPad, a laptop, whatever it was, and we're all in this room with family, not talking. I don't know, maybe we were texting each other. I don't know. But we were across the room and we're not really communicating because those devices tend to kind of isolate us from one another. Do they not? Do they not? And I'm not saying they're bad. I'm not saying they're of the devil. I'm just saying that what we see moving forward in our society is that we are a society that loves, leans into, and likes isolation and autonomy more than anything else. So then you come to church. And for the last 4 weeks, we've beaten the dead horse about groups, right? For the last 4 weeks, we've said, look, God created you for community. Jesus modeled for you community. It's beneficial to the church that you engage in community. It's beneficial to you that you engage in the community and you engage in community. And all of a sudden, immediately, I know there's certain groups of people in this congregation and in our church that are going to hear me talk about how important developing relationships and developing community are, and you're just going to push back. I know immediately there's a couple groups of people that are just going to go, yeah, but you don't know my story, but you don't know my circumstances, you don't know my situation, and you're right, I don't. But you kind of push back from it. And in all my years of doing ministry, there's two particular groups that I kind of wanted to talk about and address in the last week that kind of tend to push back from groups. The first group that tends to push back is kind of surprising, and they are the older generations in our congregation, the older generations. And when I say older, as I get older, that age goes with it. So I'm just going to say like 55 and up, right? I've offended everybody that's 55 and up right now. But this group tends to push back. And here's what they say to me when I try to engage them in groups or get them involved in groups. It happened at every church I've been at. They would say things like, well, but that's my business. I'm kind of private. I don't necessarily want somebody getting involved in my business, right? And they bought into the lie that my faith is a private thing. Which, by the way, in the New Testament, your faith was never private. Never private, never private. It's a lie, okay? And so my faith is private. It means I don't necessarily want to talk about it. It's something that's kind of personal. And so, and they'll say things like this. Well, I kind of know that groups would be good for younger folks, like folks like you, who are a little bit younger, who haven't really established their group of friends, really haven't established themselves in the community, and I can see how these would kind of be. But for an old person like me, I actually had one person say that. For an old person like me, I just don't think that it's worthwhile. I just don't see the benefits to it. The other group that tends to push back from community is a little less surprising, and that tends to be our men. Our men, they tend to want to push back. Because listen, groups sound just a little bit too much like sitting around a campfire singing Kumbaya, and that ain't very manly, right? But I'm going to get with a group of people and I'm going to tell them the things I struggle with. That's not something that I'm excited about being a part of, right? And one of the reasons why men have such a hard time with this is because men, when we come into contact with someone else, we typically either view them as a contact, a client, or competition. Let me say that again. Contact, somebody that can help further me, my career, my business. A client, someone who's already receiving some of my business, like I'm helping them in some way, right there. Or a competition, somebody that I'm competing with, right, for friends or for position or whatever. And so because that's how we view people, if we ever let a weakness show, if we ever let something that might potentially be able to come back and hurt us show, then ultimately we're giving our competition reason, right, to come after us. We're giving our clients reasons to leave, and we're giving our contacts reasons to not help promote us. And that's how men kind of view that. So as a result, they kind of push back and I don't know that I really want to engage in something like that. So we have these two groups that kind of push back. And so what I want to do today, as we finish the series, today's the last day of the series from Rows and Circles. What I want to tell you is not how circles benefit you, not how it benefits the church. I don't want to give you any more models of Jesus or tell you what God has done inside of you, how He's wired you. Today, I want to share a story and tell you about the dangers of isolation. I want to read a story from the Bible, and I want to talk about what happens when you don't engage in community. I want to tell you about the dangers. And what we're going to find as we look through this story today is that groups, community, right? Community is not something that's optional. It's critical. It's incredibly important in our lives. And when we don't engage in it, we open ourselves up to all sorts of different issues. Now, the story we're going to look at today is in 2 Samuel chapter 11. And as you're turning there, if you have grown up around church, been in church some, you have heard this story. If you're not a church person, you've heard about this story. It's the story of David and Bathsheba. And we're going to look through it today and see what happens to a king who increasingly isolates himself from other folks. So let's read a little bit and talk a little bit as we work our way through this text. Now, one other thing before we start reading this. This story we're going to look at today is a prime example of why you should read your Bible. There is some really cool stuff in here, some funny stuff in here, some sad stuff in here, and some risque stuff in here. There's parts of this story that are PG-13, if not R-rated. Okay? So, you interested? Let's read it. Chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, beginning in verse 2. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. All right? Now, you may read this and you may immediately kind of go, why is David on the roof? And why is he looking at naked women from the roof, right? Is this something that he had planned? Well, actually, no. In fact, in this culture, in this particular climate, in this area of the world, during the warm months, the roof of the house would become just an extension of the living space. And in fact, a lot of folks would go and nap or take naps on the roof of their house where it was kind of warm and there's the sun. It appears that you also would bathe on the roof of your house, right? And so when David gets up from his couch, it's probably a reference to the fact that he just woke up from his nap, right? He didn't go up there looking for trouble. He didn't assume Bathsheba was going to be out there bathing, right? He didn't know. In fact, the way the Hebrew is kind of worded, it seems to allude to the fact that it was a surprise to him. Like it was a momentary temptation. Oh my goodness, I see that, and man, she is hot. Right? And he sees this while walking on his roof. Now, those of you that might question whether the Bible is real or not, whether the Bible stories are real or whether this is really the true account of what happened, let me just kind of point out, this story wouldn't have made it into the Bible if I was writing the Bible. Nor would it have made it into the Bible if you were writing the Bible. Why? Because it paints David, a man who would be known as a man after God's own heart, right? The king of Israel. It paints him in a pretty negative light. Right? It paints a pretty negative story. The Bible includes those stories. And to me, that's amazing. Because when we read other historical documents, they leave out the bad stuff. Or blame it on other people. Right? Here, David sees this woman. And at this point, when he sees her, he should immediately bounce his eyes, walk somewhere else, get away from that, go away, get away, run away, whatever it was he's supposed to do. But look at verse 3. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Now we have to pause here. Leave that up on the screen if you don't mind. So David now, he's seen the woman, he's had the temptation, and now he's going to figure out who about it. So he calls one of his servants over, and he says, hey, who's that woman in the bath? The servant looks down and goes, watch, is this not the what? Is this not the daughter? This is somebody's daughter. Right? David, you should catch this, right? This is somebody's daughter. In fact, it's not just somebody's daughter. This guy is named Eliam. And if you read a little bit more of the Old Testament narrative, you find out that Eliam was not just some kind of regular dude in Jerusalem. He was one of David's boys. He was one of David's men. In fact, a few chapters earlier, this guy Eliam gives David some really good advice on what it is that he should do as he ascends to the throne in Jerusalem. So it's not just anybody's daughter. David, this is one of your best advisors' daughters. And then look what else. Not only is she a daughter, she's a what? The wife. The what? The wife. She's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And you know Uriah the Hittite, he's just not a regular guy hanging out in Jerusalem either. Uriah the Hittite, he's one of your 30. He's one of your mighty men. He's one of those individuals that fought alongside you as you moved towards the throne in Jerusalem. He's one of those guys that even as you go out in battle now, he's one of your right-hand men. He's one of those guys that would never leave you and never abandon you and fight to the end. So much so that he's made it into this special group called David's Mighty Men that they write entire chapters about in the Bible. David. It's not just some girl. This is somebody's daughter who you love and care about. This is somebody's wife who you love and care about. David. This is who it is. But I want you to understand something. The servant doesn't rebuke David. The servant doesn't tell David, hey, you should lay off. Right? Why does the servant not say anything to David about what it is he's about to do? Because he's a servant. And you know what servants do? They take orders. And this servant, certainly, he could have said, David, you shouldn't do this. But if he says that to the king, he might not live through the night. In fact, Andy Stanley says it this way. The reason that the servant doesn't say anything to David is because he's receiving a paycheck from David. He's on the payroll. As a result, well, he's just going to, David, okay, whatever you say, you're the king, right? Look what happens next. So, verse 4. So David sent messengers and took her. She came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from uncleanliness, and then she returned to her house. So he brings her up to his apartment. He's the king, right? She's not going to refuse anything the king wants, and she sleeps with him. Now, the reason that I think it has this little parentheses in there about her purifying herself from her cleanliness is that it lets us know that this interaction with Bathsheba may have happened just one time, but it likely went on for about a month at least. You with me? Okay? Because this cleanliness had to do with ceremonial cleanliness, and when once a month women would become ceremonially unclean, and then they would go through a purification process. You with me? And then again the next month they would become ceremonially unclean. Right? This is because we have kids in here. I'm trying to. Okay, you with me? All right, and then they would be ceremonially, they would cleanse themselves again. You tracking with me? And so the reason I think this is in here is it lets us know this probably wasn't a one-night fling. It probably wasn't just a once and done, right? It may have been something that went on and on, but that's conjecture. We're kind of guessing when we start talking about that in the text. We don't know exactly. Nonetheless, David had had his fling. He's had his affair. Now, meanwhile, he's got more wives and concubines than he can probably count and can remember their names anyway, but he wants Bathsheba, the daughter of his friend, the wife of his friend. And so he takes Bathsheba. It says then that she goes back into her house. Look at verse 5. And the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. All over it, like David's life had sound effects. It would be bum, 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 right? Here's the moment. And David thinks to himself, okay, here's what we've got to do. We've got to control the situation. Here's what we got to do. We've got a situation, we've got problems, but I'm the king. All right? And we can't let word out that Bathsheba is pregnant by me. She's got a husband, right? She's got a daddy that are my boys, that are my men. Like, I get that. And meanwhile, it just looks bad. Word will get out. People will know, right? So I've got to control the issue. What David doesn't realize is that word's already out. Because the servants know. And you want to know one thing about a slave culture? Slaves talk. All you had to do to find out what was going on with David is talk to one of his servants. One of the servants knew what every other servant knew. That was just kind of part of it. Word was already out. And in fact, this is not all that different from today, although not with slaves, with employees. You understand, if you operate a business and you have employees that work for you, you realize your employees talk. I had a buddy that was running an organization in a particular town that shall go nameless. And he had about 35 people that worked for him, under him, men and women. And he began to have an affair with his second in command, with his vice president. And it was one of those things that he thought no one knew about. When it finally came out, he was like, nobody knows. But what he didn't realize is that it was already over town. Why? Because the people that worked for him, they saw things, they heard things, they knew things, and they started talking. And so what he thought he was hiding, really he wasn't hiding at all. It was already out. And what David thinks he's fixing to control is information that is already being leaked out into the public. We just know that, okay? But what he's going to do is he's going to control the situation. Let's talk to men for just a minute, because we tend to be a little more controlling, right? Have you ever been in that spot where all of a sudden something goes wrong, something doesn't happen the way that you're supposed to do, and your natural reaction is just to kind of control it? All right, what do I need to do to shore up my margins, to tie up my loose ends, to make sure that everything kind of gets contained so that word doesn't get out? Have you ever been there? This morning, ironically, I was driving to church and was listening to Focus on the Family. They have a little deal that comes on the radio, and they were talking about teen pregnancy in particular. and they were asking a woman that has made a living out of counseling teenage girls who had gotten pregnant unexpectedly, and he said, what's the biggest surprise? And she said, the biggest surprise to me is the number of Christian families and the number of pastors that ask their daughters to go get abortions. And he asked, well, why is that? And she said, well, it's the shame of it. If word gets out, then it's no longer in control. And people, when faced with extreme circumstances, will often go to extreme measures to see if we can control the situation, to see if we can control the outcome and control what people know and what people think. And for David, he couldn't have this getting out. She comes to him, I'm pregnant, bum, bum, bum. Now all of a sudden, David's going to have to figure out what he's going to do. So he comes up with a plan. Verse 6. So David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing and how the people were doing and how the war was going. Now, let's just talk for just a minute. This is Uriah. He's one of David's mighty men. He's one of the best warriors on the field of battle. If you want to know how the war's going, you don't call for Uriah, right? You call for some private somewhere that isn't making a difference. You call for a messenger. You call for... So I can only imagine what's going on in Uriah's mind. Oh, the king wants to see me. And he shows back up and the king goes, hey, I just want to know how things are going with Joab. Well, David, I feel like I should be fighting with him, right? Like, why am I here? But nonetheless, I'll do whatever it is you want, my king. And so he asks how the war is going. Verse 8. Then David says to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. You got to love Hebrew. Let me tell you what he's saying. Go to your house, kick off your shoes, make love to your wife. That's what he's saying, right? This is a euphemism in the Hebrew that we miss in English. But that's what he's getting at. I want you to go and I want you to sleep with your wife. And the reason I want you to do it is because this. Once you sleep with her and don't she turns out pregnant, guess what? It's Uriah's baby, right? That's all we have to do. Situation controlled. Look what he does. I love this. And Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. Now the king makes it even better. I'd like to know what the present is. Probably choice foods from the king's table. Probably the best kind of wine to go with him. David is setting the mood, right? He's doing everything he can to make sure that what needs to go down in Uriah's house goes down. You tracking with me? He even sends a gift, right? This is the equivalent of being like, yeah, let's send up a bottle of champagne to that room right there. Right? That's exactly what he's doing. Now, look what happens. Verse 9. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of the Lord, of his Lord, and did not go down to his house. Uriah is such a better man than David. Right? He goes and he sleeps with the guard, the palace guard. He goes and he stays with the soldiers. He's not going to go to his house and sleep in his bed. He's not going to go see his wife. He's not going to do that. He goes and he's a soldier, and he stays with the soldiers. Verse 10. When they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, have you not come home from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house? Verse 11. Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah dwells in booths, in tents, out on the battlefield. And my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go into my house and eat and drink and to lie with my wife? I love this, as you live. David, I'm going to take an oath upon you. You have done horrible things to me, and I may or may not be aware of it, but here's the deal. As you live, and as your, David's soul lives, I will not do this thing. Will not. I cannot. That's not right. I won't. And David, as long as you're my king, and as long as you're alive, I will not disgrace you, and I won't disgrace our people by going and doing that. I'm just not going to do that. You read this and you go, man, Uriah is an awesome dude. Especially when you compare him to David at this point. Verse 12. Then David said to Uriah, remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back. One more day. So because he's the king, Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. Verse 13, this is why you should read your Bible. And David invited him, and he ate in his presence and drank, so that he made him drunk. This is sometimes people argue that the wine that they drank in the Old Testament was not alcoholic, or the wine they drank. He was drunk, right? It's pretty clear. All right, so he says he made him drunk. The goal, right, is to get him so drunk that he's going to go home and sleep with his wife. And in the evening, he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of the Lord, but he did not go down to his house. David's first attempt to control doesn't work, right? I can't do that, Uriah would say. Because, Joab is out in a sleeping bag in the field, right? With a rock for a pillow. I can't do that to him. The next night, David gets him drunk, and even in a drunken state, he's like, nope, can't do that. He goes out and he sleeps with the servants. David has tried twice to try to control the situation, to try to fix the situation, and now he's at his last chance. So look what he does. Verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab, who was the leader of his army, and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And in the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die. He says, I can't control the situation by having him go and sleep with his wife and cover it up that way. There's only one more way David can think of to control it. We'll just have to kill Uriah. So he writes down on a paper, parchment. He seals it with the king's seal. And Uriah carries his own death warrant to the field of battle. Never knows any different. The rest of the story goes something like this. Joab puts him in the front of the fighting, and they actually storm a city, get up to the city. Many of David's servants and soldiers end up dying. And sure enough, as they withdraw, there stands Uriah by himself. Uriah is struck down, and he's killed as well. Problem solved. Jump ahead with me, if you will. I want to read verse 26. When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she lamented over her husband. And when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her into his house. She became his wife and bore him a son. She became his wife, and she conceived immediately. Right? Wow, what a blessing from God. Problem solved. You see, it wasn't solved. Because there were people that knew. God knew. Right? The servants knew. David's children knew. See, what David viewed as like a one-time mess up, right? As an affair that went bad and got this girl pregnant, that had someone killed. Ultimately, you need to understand the implications from this event would carry along with David throughout the rest of his life. The child that was born to Bathsheba ends up dying. David's adult children, right, had a tainted view of their father from here on out. In fact, David's credibility with his children was totally ruined from here on out. He had another adult son kill another adult son who he claimed had slept with a sister. He then had that adult son rebel against him, try to take over his kingdom. David would actually have to run away from Jerusalem, take some of his army, some of his men, and run away from Jerusalem as his son marched into Jerusalem proclaiming that he was the new king. He actually then took some of David's concubines and went up on the roof of the palace and had his way with them. Same roof that just a few years before David had stood on and watched a young woman bathe. See, sometimes I think we think that our sin is just something that kind of happens here and we can contain it and control it, keep it here. But you need to understand your sin is something that carries with you sometimes. And the consequences of that sin carry with you and you have to deal with for a long time. This is one of the things that I want to try to tell our teenagers when I get to talk to them. Hey, look, it's not a momentary decision. It's a pathway. Right? It's not just a momentary kind of fleeting thing. It's a direction that you're moving in. And that direction is going to take you to a destination. And it may not be the destination you want to go to. But David made some decisions. They put him on a pathway and they led him to a destination, one that ultimately he didn't want to go to. Now, there's great grace in this. God forgave David. God referred to David as a man after his own heart. But the consequences of this sin, they stayed with David and they stayed with his family for the rest of his life. Look at chapter 12, verse 1. Chapter 12, verse 1. This is what we say. And the Lord sent Nathan to David. Why? Why does the Lord send Nathan to David? Because Nathan is the only one that can speak truth into David's life who isn't on the payroll. Nathan is the only one that can go and go, David, here's what's really going on, and not worry about getting a paycheck from the man. And not worry about what he might do to him. God sends Nathan to David. Watch, so important. Because David is the only one that has access to Nathan is the only one that has access to David's heart. So God sends Nathan. Why is Nathan the only one that has access to David's heart? Well, there's a part of the story that I skipped. Go back to chapter 11 and look at verse 1. The verse that starts off this entire story. And in fact, this was one of those things I didn't see until just a few months ago when another pastor got up and he shared this from the story. It's one of those things that if you read the Bible long enough, God will put things there that weren't there the first time you read it. This is one of those things for me. Chapter 11, verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David, what? Remained in Jerusalem. Let's talk for just a minute. What should David have been doing? Going out. It was the time of the year when kings go fight battles. He should have gone and fought a battle. He was a king. He was a warrior. He had fought with these individuals. He had sat beside them in caves while they were hiding from their enemies. And he had linked arms with them as they charged cities that they were trying to take in the name of the Lord. Listen, let me tell you something. David was a warrior, military man. And the time of the year when he should have been going out with his army, what does he do? It's so important. He sends his boys, Joab, who he had fought alongside with so much that he made him the leader of his army. His mighty men, those individuals that he knew had his back and he had theirs, no matter what the case. And he had fought with these men and he sent them out. Can I tell you something? I'm not a military guy. I'm so blessed to have been around a bunch of folks that are in the military, and my grandpa was in the Navy. And about 8 months ago, I got to do a funeral for a guy that had been in the Navy. His name was Mike. And as I go to do this funeral, it's neat. I get to see all of the different sailors that he had been in the Navy with over the years, and they came back to the funeral and began to talk, and they began to tell stories about Mike and the things they had experienced. And although they didn't necessarily talk every day or every week or maybe even every month, there was still this connection that they had. People that have been in the military, you get it? There's still that connection that you have with somebody that you fought with someone that you've been in a foxhole with, right? My grandpa was like that. He also served in the Navy during Vietnam, and he would tell stories about men that he had been on the ship with, men that were closer than any brother he could ever have because of the things they had experienced with one another. You tracking with me? Those of you that have been in the military or know people in the military, maybe you've experienced that. All of those men that David had created all of those relationships with, David sent them out. He remained. And David isolated himself from anyone that could speak truth into his life. He isolated himself from anyone that had access to his heart. And as a result, when temptation came unexpectedly, he had no one to stand up and go, David, this is not what I do. David, this is not something that you should do. What David found out with Bathsheba is that community isn't optional. It's critical. You understand, men, we have issues, don't we? All of us do. We deal with jealousy and with unholy pride. We deal with envy when we look at the man next to us and we look at the guy that has the better car and the better looking wife or whatever it is. Don't tell your wife I said that, right? We look at that and we go, oh man, look, he has the things that I want and he is where I want to be and his bank account is bigger and blah, 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 blah. And they're competitors with us or they're clients with us or they're contacts. They're one of those things and we deal with that. And yet we struggle with attitudes and with matters of our heart all the time. Men, we do. And you can deny it, but it's just true, isn't it? You can deny it, but we deal with anger, don't we? We deal with frustration. We deal with hurt. And our society has kind of told us it's not manly for you to talk about that. It's not manly for you to do anything with that. But can I just tell you something? If you don't give someone else, other than your spouse, another man, access to your heart, you are putting yourself in an incredibly dangerous situation. And by the time it comes out, it may be too late. Crosswind Church, we want to create a place where people connect. We want to create a church where people can become a part of something that's bigger than they are. We want to have a church where people feel like they're welcome and that they belong. But can I tell you something that I can't do in Rose? I can't really deal with the matters that's going on inside of your heart. I can raise the issue. Right? We can have a service and sing a song and we can raise something up and you can kind of deal with it. You may even shed a tear or come up here to the altar and pray and all that. But ultimately, when we're in Rose, you have the opportunity to walk out those doors and remain completely unchanged based on what you've heard in here today. But it's not that way in Circles. In Circles, not only can we raise matters of the heart, can we raise attitudes of the heart, but now we can deal with them. Now we can give some practical advice. Now we can give some helpful accountability. Now we can give some helpful belonging and some helpful care so that you can deal with those issues that are keeping you from being the husband you want to be and keeping you from being the father that you want to be. And it's in groups that is best going to happen. See, I didn't do a 5-week series on home groups because I want our numbers in home group to go up so we can report it to some convention somewhere that doesn't even care. I don't care about that. I want you to be a part of a group because I'm absolutely convinced they can change your life. I'm absolutely convinced. I believe that your life is better when you belong. Your life is better when you have accountability. Your life is better when you have a system for care. That occurs when you give other people access to your heart. I want to tell you a story about a man named Robert. In fact, he was never a member of one of my churches. I don't know how really I got affiliated with him. Robert was one of those individuals that early on, I kind of felt like he had something to prove. The first time he ever talked to me, I was on the phone, and he wanted to be sure to give me all of his credentials and his standing in his church and all that. So we went through this long thing, and this is who I am and what I do and what represents me. Okay, right? He felt like, or I felt like, and this may not be true, but I kind of felt like he always felt like he was a step behind other people. He was kind of having to build his business, and he was doing pretty well at that, but yet there always seemed to be somebody else that had something that he didn't have. And then Robert got hurt. He did something and messed his back up. He ended up having to go and have an operation to do some repair work on his back. And the doctors began prescribing pain medicine for Robert. And he began to take the pain medicine. Before long, he began to take more of it than the doctor had been prescribing and running out of pills. And the pain wasn't going away. And he was going back to the doctor. And they were prescribing him more and more and more drugs over and over again. Eventually, Robert became addicted to the pills. And he was taking them all the time. As many as 20 or 30 pills a day of pain medication he was using. Eventually, the doctors wouldn't prescribe him anymore or wouldn't prescribe enough to meet his growing addiction. And so he had to start going to the black market where he would pay between $5 and $20 per pill that he would take. He ran through the savings account pretty quick and then started using money that was set aside to pay their house payment. When we finally found out, Robert was about 6 months late on all of his mortgage payments. He was about 6 months behind. And the bank had begun foreclosure proceedings. But nonetheless, he felt like he had to kind of control it. I just got to control it, right? If I can just make a little more money, if I can just get this under control, if I can just kind of move stuff around here. And so then he started taking things from their house and selling them, pawning them. In fact, he went so far as to stage a break-in to his house. Told the cops in the police report they took a laptop and a computer and his wife's wedding ring, when in reality he took all of them down to the pawn shop, pawned them to get money so he could go buy more drugs. A functioning addict, because during the day you couldn't tell he was on anything, but he was totally doped out of his mind. He eventually started pairing the drugs with alcohol because he couldn't get enough of the drugs, and so he'd start drinking along with that and developed an addiction to that. And things got worse and worse and worse until he could no longer hide it anymore. He was passing out in the shower. He was having unusual conversations with his children that just didn't make sense. A couple trips to the ER and the paramedics having to break down the door to his house later. We discovered that he was well in over his head. His addiction had just kind of taken him by control, and there was nothing else he could do. I mentioned that his house was in foreclosure. After we got Robert into rehab, the first of 3 stays he would have there. The bank foreclosed on his house. His wife filed for divorce, remarried shortly thereafter. And Robert was left all alone again. Ultimately, after his 3rd stay in rehab, he began working a job that he had gotten through one of the rehab facilities. Seemed to be kind of getting his feet back up under him. And he lost his life. So he died. And I remember thinking, had Robert had someone that had access to his heart, if Robert had someone that he could have talked to, would he still be here today? Maybe, maybe not. But I can tell you this, he'd have a better chance. He'd have a better chance. But his isolationism, his autonomy, his American dream ended up costing him everything, including his life. I remember the last conversation I had with Robert before he died. His daughter, this teenage girl, she was having a birthday party. And it was going to be at his ex-wife's house, new house, with her new husband. The whole family was there, and Robert had been invited to the party. He went to the party, and there was this house, and his ex-wife, and her husband, and his kids, right? And everybody's running around, and everybody's happy. And he said it was a fine time at the party, and then the end of the evening came. And I had to leave. I had to leave my children. I had to leave my wife with another man. He called me on his way to the liquor store to talk about how alone he felt. And I remember thinking, Robert, if you had only given someone access to your heart's soul, maybe, I'm not saying for certain, but maybe all of this could have been avoided. Listen, circles are not optional. They're essential. They're critical. We have got to learn to move out of our rows and into circles where we can be authentic, where we can be real, where we can receive accountability, where we can feel like we belong, and where we can get the care that we need to become the Christians, the followers of Jesus that He wants us to be. It's not just some kind of fancy saying that I say because it sounds good. I believe it. Circles are better than rows. There's 2 things you can't do by yourself. One's be married, and the other is be a Christian. I believe it, and I've lived it. And I wonder if today, maybe some of you men would just go, you know what? It's going to hurt, and it's going to stink, and I'm not going to like it, but I'm getting in a circle because it's essential. Because I don't know what will happen if no one has access to my heart. Maybe some of you ladies, right? who are afraid of what the gossip mill might say if you expose some of your struggles and some of your difficulties. And you go, I just don't know that I can open myself up. You've been hurt by other women. You've been hurt by other men. It doesn't matter. And you go, I just don't know that I can do this. Listen, can I tell you something? Circles are better than rows. Circles are not optional. They're critical. Maybe you're a couple and you thought, man, that's something for the younger folks. That's something I don't really need. Can I tell you a secret? Sometimes groups aren't about what they can do for you. They're about what you can do for others. And your children may be grown and raised, but there's probably someone in your group who doesn't have grown and raised children. And they might could benefit from some of your wisdom. A young couple that's been married 7 years might gain from your wisdom and how you make it through those rough times in marriage. Right? And my guess is that if you go into it thinking, I might be able to speak some wisdom, I might be able to speak some biblical truth, I might be able to share from my experiences, that somewhere along the line, you'll receive a benefit from that as well. Someone will be able to speak words of wisdom into your life. Someone will be able to give you accountability in the area that you're struggling with. Someone will be able to give you care when you most need it. As we conclude our service, Kyle's going to come and he's going to play. And here's what I want us to pray for today. Will you just pray for our groups? We have new groups forming, smaller groups. We have groups that have 4 people in them, right? And that's phenomenal. I can't wait to see God bless them and them grow, right? We have groups that are meeting for the first time tonight. Groups that met for the first time 3 weeks ago. We've got groups that have been around with the same leader for 15 years, right? I get it. Will you pray that God would break down those barriers and those walls that we put up without reason? That God would remove all the pretense and remove all the mask and allow us to kind of enter into each other's chaos. And allow us to do life together in a non-judgmental, totally out of love kind of way. As we all are on a journey to Christ-likeness. It very well may be the fact that the push you need is from somebody in a circle rather than a row.